The U.S. has been after China on multiple fronts, from trade to national security. It has been almost relentless in its pursuit of criticizing China. And it appears some of U.S.'s allies are also on board. Or are they? Well, in this edition of the debate, we will look at whether countries like Canada are bending due to U.S. pressure and sanctions, scare tactic, and whether the EU bloc is also joining the U.S. in condemning China on a variety of fronts.
Tensions have grown between China and Western nations, spearheaded by the U.S. since Beijing introduced a new national security law for Hong Kong. The legislation that came into effect on Tuesday punishes crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces with up to life in prison. Britain has described the security law as a clear and serious violation of the 1984 Joint Declaration, under which it handed back its colony to China 13 years later, drawing a strong backlash from Beijing.
The UK government keeps making irresponsible remarks on Hong Kong affairs through its so-called 6-monthly report on Hong Kong. These moves constitute a gross interference in China's internal affairs.
China also came down on Canada for suspending its extradition treaty with Hong Kong and halting exports of sensitive military gear amid the spat over the legislation.
This severely violates the basic principles of international law and international relations and grossly interferes in China's internal affairs. China strongly condemns this action and reserves the right to take further response. Canada must bear all consequences that will arise from this.
Apart from the row over the law that the U.S. itself called a tragedy, the role that China's tech giant Huawei could play in the 5G networks of Western countries has been another source of friction. The U.S. has urged its allies to exclude the Chinese firm, saying Beijing could use the technology for spying. China has denied the allegations. Tensions between China and the West further came into the spotlight after the U.S. conducted naval exercises in the South China Sea over the weekend.
The United States deliberately dispatched massive forces to conduct large-scale military exercise in the relevant waters of the South China Sea to show off its military power. This is a gesture with ulterior motives. The U.S. move is intended to drive a wedge among countries in the region, boost militarization of the South China Sea, and undermine peace and stability in the South China Sea.
Relations between the U.S. and China have continued to deteriorate since President Trump took office in 2017. Trump's policies, including withdrawal from international treaties, have also created a wedge between Washington and its Western allies. It now remains to be seen whether the U.S. will be able to keep its allies on board in its anti-China agenda.
Joining us in this debate, political analyst and commentator Michael Lane joins us from Washington, D.C. We also have investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joins us from Bristol. Gentlemen, welcome. Tony Gosling, let me first start with you. When it comes to the U.S., it has been on the offensive regarding China on a variety of fronts, maybe too many to even cover in this one program. Can you name some of the top issues that the U.S. has a beef with China on?
Well, let's start with Huawei, because I think it's one of the most important, actually, because this arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, in Canada has been probably the biggest and most important thing that has precipitated this latest bout of the crisis, particularly the demonstrations in Hong Kong. Many people don't link it back to this, but that's actually key. The Chinese wanted to introduce a similar sort of extradition law that Canada has to America with the Hong Kong and China. And that's the reason why the Chinese have got so upset, is because their chief financial officer of one of their most important tech companies has been arbitrarily arrested, effectively by the US in Canada. I mean, the other thing is, I hate to break it to people, but any piece of equipment, any electronic equipment with a microprocessor in it is possible to be used for spying. Now, whoever made that microprocessor, whoever made that piece of equipment, is the person who would probably be best placed to use it for spying. But I'm afraid even our laptops, everything we've got, effectively, when there's a microprocessor in there, you don't know for certain, but the person who made it knows whether that can be surreptitiously used to basically what they call sniff information from it. So, you know, this is a pot calling the kettle black with the United States, because, of course, most of this technology around the world is not Huawei technology, it's US technology. And the US, I think, is really taking the mickey when it's just pointing the finger at Huawei. We in the media should be pointing the finger in both directions, both at the US manufacturers and at the Chinese manufacturers, and saying, well, you know, what we need really is international protocols to make sure that our data is secure. So that you asked for one point. That's one I would say, and I think that could be settled with some sensible global protocols about how this equipment is manufactured and how it is marketed to guarantee people's safety. But actually, the way the big corporations like it is they want the data to be stealable. When it comes to the criticism that we just heard there from the ambassador Louis Choming in London, the Chinese ambassador in London, he's saying that the British are doing gross interference. Now, hang on a minute, because all we've effectively done, the British government, is to say that if Chinese people feel they're being persecuted, they can come to Britain. Now, this is a normal thing that has happened in many colonies, the British colonies, where there's been trouble. For example, in the West Indies, many people have come to Britain from there over the years. So there's nothing strange about this. But what this does tell me is that the Chinese are not used to criticism. What they've got, I'm afraid, is they've got a system where what President Xi says goes, and they see any kind of criticism as an attack, and they don't actually accept it, and they don't listen to it. It's not part of the culture. It's a very, very regimented culture. And that's the problem with China, is they see legitimate criticism as an attack. And that's why I think that the Chinese ambassador has said this. I think most of the world will be shrugging their shoulders and thinking, well, this is not gross interference to allow Chinese people to come to Britain if they want. That's just normal.
Well, let's see here. We need to do a little bit of a history check here. But before that, there was an instance, Michael Lane, where the U.S. cited China as being a national security the #1 national security threat to the U.S. Why does U.S. feel that China is that kind of a threat?
You know, it has been going back and forth for decades as to whether China is the larger threat or whether Russia is the larger threat. Some of that internal debate in the United States is based on politics and political viewpoint. Some of it is an actual disagreement as to which one poses the larger national security threat to the United States. I'm one of those people that actually thinks China, for the long term, is a much larger threat to the United States than Russia, primarily because it's on path to become a much richer country. I mean, look at its GDP. It's already competing directly with the United States for the title of largest economy in the world. It's a fairly rich country, notwithstanding the way the assets are distributed within the country. The speed with which it is developing a military capability over the last 20-25 years is absolutely astronomical. They're catching up with the United States. They are right now. We saw this last weekend. There's an active competition between the United States and China for influence. Primary hegemony in the South China Sea. They had a dispute on their border, which resulted in 50 dead soldiers about 2.5 weeks ago with India, 3 weeks ago. So they are really building up their military, and they are now rich enough to sustain that unless they have a significant economic downturn. And I think that's why in the United States we view the Chinese as the most significant long-term threat.
Did any of those instances there that our guest Michael Lane stated, Tony Gosling, pose a direct threat to the U.S. or even an indirect one, in your opinion?
Well, yes, of course, they're economic threats, but they're not military threats. This is the thing. The United Nations Security Council will and should get involved if there's a military threat. But actually, the US is seeing economic threats as military threats. That's effectively because we know that countries use, and Britain used it in World War II, the Germans did too, economic warfare. This is an attempt to undermine a foreign state using economic means. So there's a bit of a blurring of the lines. But I don't think that the main reason the United States sees this as such a fundamental threat, the economic threat, is because the US is failing economically. It's failing to compete. And it doesn't like to actually examine its own Federal Reserve, its own private ownership of its financial system and its money system, whereas China is largely still controlled by the government, the finances, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why China has been so economically successful. It hasn't handed over power to create money to the private banks, as the United States and Europe have done. But look, getting back to Britain for a minute, because I think this is, Britain's colonial role is quite important here. I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy with China in many, many ways. I think their foreign policy attitudes have been much better. The Americans have had a horrendous foreign policy, basically regime change policy, which is an attempt to dominate the entire planet, surround Iran, surround China with military bases, this kind of thing. But one thing I would say about the Chinese is that this one country, two systems agreement they made with Britain back in 1997, the agreement was it should run for 50 years. There's still 27 more years to run. The Hong Kong people deserve that extra 27 years. They deserve the Chinese to stick to that agreement. And it's absolutely appalling to see that they basically last week just tore it up. They said, well, OK, we're just going to have one country now. We're going to impose all of our national security laws. We saw at the weekend, we saw the removal of books from the libraries which question the political system in China. What we're leading to now is a state, an authoritarian state, where there's no free speech. That's the real problem for the Hong Kongers, and that's why it's a bit rich for the Chinese ambassador to London, Louis Chongming, to accuse the British when actually it's the Chinese that have torn this agreement up and put the fear of God into millions of Hong Kongers.
Well, we're looking also at Canada, talking about that. Michael Lane, in terms of how it views that is no longer the case with Hong Kong in terms of holding its own. But China obviously is saying, this is our matter. This is an internal affair in a sense. And they also don't agree with the way that the protests are broken out in Hong Kong. The debate we're having tonight, the topic is where each country stands. Now let's zoom in, Michael Lane, if we can, on the EU as a whole, if we can, as a bloc, and mention certain countries like Germany, the UK perhaps. Where do they stand when it comes to China? We were under the impression that the EU maybe was sliding or had a tendency to go towards China, but it doesn't seem like with the Hong Kong incidents, at least it stands that way.
Yeah, well, the European countries have always been much less adversarial, much more diplomatic, always looking for that reasonable diplomatic solution. Americans would complain about the Europeans that they would frequently in the diplomatic arena give away too much because they were not hard bargainers, they were easy bargainers. Witness Neville Chamberlain in World War II. So that is what they have historically been. I think that China is currently got so many balls in the air, confrontations that they are participating in, that it makes me wonder what their motivation is to have this all come together at this time. And when you've got so many balls in the air at one time, you're likely to have a difference or even an adversarial difference with almost everybody in the world. And that's why I think the Europeans are being less diplomatic about this with the Hong Kong thing. Although who couldn't predict this 23 years ago? I mean, you saw what China was 23 years ago. Britain wanted to unload the problem they had of being viewed as the imperial power. So they signed a horrendous agreement with really no enforcement mechanism with China. And it took them 23 years out of 50 to essentially break that and declare that not only is it not now one country but two systems, so now they're saying it's one country and one system. And I think Europe is sticking together, or is likely in the end to stick together with the Brits on this one. They were the ones that gave it away under a ridiculous agreement, but nonetheless, they think they have the moral high ground, and if there's one thing Europe loves to stand on, it's what they perceive the moral high ground to be.
Well, the Hong Kong issue was something that maybe many European countries, Tony Gosling, did side with the U.S. on when it came to that issue. However, looking at even the news that came out just today, it seems like the EU countries are actually somewhat distancing themselves overall when it comes to the U.S. For a whole host of issues, and that has to do a lot of it with trade. And they do want to either engage or re-engage with China as a strategic and economic partner. Of course, we're living in the COVID-19 world right now, but basically the EU to want to decrease its reliance on the U.S. Do you think that that is the route that the EU as a whole is going to take, or do we have to take a look at each country respectively?
Well, I think as the EU credibility starts to fail, and I'm afraid that many countries, individual countries within the European Union, are looking less and less to Brussels as a trustworthy place, because what's been happening is that, for example, with the COVID-19 you just mentioned there's been an enormous lack of trust and confidence in Brussels' ability to deal with it. Basically Germany and the rich countries have just simply, for many months, refused to hand over money to the poorer countries. Now, if you're going to have a credible system in Brussels, you're going to have to redistribute the wealth of Europe in order to make sure that everybody has a fair chance of surviving COVID-19. They just refuse to do that. And I think that's actually dented a lot of the credibility that Brussels has had. If it had a lot, which obviously I'm a bit biased as a Brit, they don't have a lot of credibility. They tend to do what the Americans do, with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, for example. They talk all the right things, but they don't act as they should do. So, I think mainly people will be looking at, to answer your question, to their individual national governments who will come up with, I think, much more sensible policies, more credible policies. But look, also look at the whole China picture, because we would not want to live under a system that is now being implemented in China, this social credit system, where every individual is looked at to do with how compliant they are. Is this a good citizen? They say a good citizen, but it really means, do they work loyally, pay their taxes? Do they obey the law at all times, whatever the law may be? And those people are, as part of this social credit system, they're being basically buoyed up. They're given more points. They can use more facilities, and those that aren't are stopped from doing it. So if you, for example, cause trouble at work by starting a trade union, or you start to ask for more wages, you can have your score disappear. And this system is really an appalling system. And let me also say that we do have blacklisting in the West. So blacklisting does affect people in a similar way in the West as happening in China. And you might say that what's happening in China with social credit has been going on for years in the West anyway, secretly. But those are the sorts of things we've got to look at when it comes to whether China has got its credibility in the world. And I think the statements made today about Hong Kong are really, the Chinese are not doing themselves any credit by trying to blame Britain for the fact that Hong Kongers feel afraid of an authoritarian state and may come over the seas. I think that should be, everybody in the world should be actually free to leave their country if they feel under threat, and Hong Kongers should be no exception.
Okay, I'm going to try to put two countries together here for you, Michael Lane, when it comes to China, and that is the UK and Canada. And I'm going to bring in the issue of Huawei. You just had the UK, which indicating that it may phase out, if it hasn't made that decision already, the adoption of the Huawei 5G network or technology. At the same time, you have Canada, who was involved with the detainment of the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, and that put Canada on a collision course with China, along with what happened regarding Hong Kong, in which Prime Minister Trudeau came out and said that this is an intrusion on Hong Kong. Why is Canada weighing in on on China the way that it is? Because looking at the way that I'm looking for a response that China has made on this, in which it said at this point that Canada's decision to suspend this treaty is a political move overriding the rule of law. That's Hong Kong's Secretary for Security, John Lee. What exactly is China saying there about Canada?
Well, as I mentioned in my previous answer, China has so many balls in the air at this point that they're likely to offend someone and almost everyone with something that they're doing. Perhaps they're moving worldwide, taking cover of the confusion around the world due to COVID-19, or perhaps they think they have reached the stature where they can get away with this many moves at one time, or whatever. But they are literally in an adversarial position with almost everyone in the world at this point, to one extent or the other. So it's not surprising that Canada would be one of them. As far as the Huawei thing is concerned, you know, it was very late that the United States decided it was going to lead the charge against Huawei on this. It would have been much better had they done it earlier. But look at Huawei as a company. They are experienced. They make a good product. They know how to put something together that works. They have it now. They can deliver now, as opposed to waiting a certain amount of time for it to happen. So the world was sort of seduced by this this great deal. And it was only sort of after Huawei had established itself as the go-to corporate entity to get your 5G networks done that the United States said, well, wait a second, let's look at what Huawei is. They are a state-owned corporation. They can, as my colleague mentioned, you know, anything that they manufacture and put into these networks can be used as spy equipment, and they're the ones that will know how it works, how to activate it, and how to gather the data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And given the position where the Trump administration is taking a more direct adversarial position against China, more so than any previous administration, which had all sort of said, you know, we really need to get along to China. That's the key to bringing them into the capitalistic world. Then part of what Trump did was coming up with the no, we can't have Huawei do the 5G thing. A little late. People are trying to reverse courses in some cases. In some cases, they might think they're already too far down the road to reverse that course. But the fact that China is currently picking a fight with almost everyone makes it easier for those people who were sort of comfortable with the Huawei solution to maybe take a second look at it and maybe reevaluate their decision.
You got about a minute or a little less than that, Tony Gosling. I'm sure you've heard of documentary filmmaker John Pilger, who said that promoted the coming war on China. Do you think that that is indeed the route that the U.S. is taking, and who's going to be on board if that is what the U.S. has in mind when it comes to China?
It certainly is. It's almost unthinkable, isn't it? But it isn't. A lot of people are thinking about this. Military people, people who make money out of war. The purpose of such a war, you might say, what's the point of that? Well, the idea, I think, is to try and bring about a one-world government, a kind of new world order that we're not supposed to even mention exists. But look at the role of the mafia and secret societies in governments in the West and in the East, the use of blackmail stooges and in politics by politicians. You might laugh, but actually in the United States they have Freemasonry, which is extremely powerful. I saw pictures of Bill Clinton in Masonic outfit, even though he's never supposed to have been a Mason, he was. And in China they had the triads. So what you could be looking at here is a third force, almost like a kind of Bond film, a third force behind the scene, hardening the sides, making sure that people are either on one side or the other in a preparation for a third world war. I think John Pilger could be right.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Let me thank our guest, political analyst and commentator Michael Lane, and thank you, investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Cover Top, the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.